So welcome, everyone. So although we met yesterday, we weren't recording it for publication. We are recording it today. And Chris and Ian, as you weren't here yesterday, we were talking, one of the things was about PAG effectiveness. And as part of that, we've been experimenting with how we use the chat compared to how we use make other points. And in general, it's good not to use the chat for making points, but I would say that especially if English is not your first language and it helps you to first formulate a point in the chat, then use it that way. But for those whose English is their first language, I think we should try and just use the show hand function and make your points verbally. And if English is your first language and you're making a point verbally, then try and speak slowly and make sure that you're not using complex phrases and terms. Were some of the things we learned. We will be making further use of small group breakouts today as well. I think that's generally been acknowledged as a good way of kind of getting conversations going and delving into the issues. And what we've just, Karen and I and Sam have had a brief meeting about that. What we're going to try today is we'll stay with the same groups for the three times that we're meeting. And we've sort of broken you up by sort of stakeholder group. So there'll be a group that's kind of audit focused, which Chris Harris will no longer be in because he's now an Mpos. So hopefully the rest of you will know who you are. There'll be a NPOs group where Jenny, Tejas, Innocent, Chris. I think I've got everyone there. Yes, will be. And then there's a kind of donor interests group where we put Philip. We'd like to put you in that group if that's all right, with Dorothea and Monica. We haven't got Monica yet. Have I got that correct, Sam? And are you forming the groups on the? Yes, excellent. Good. Then the other thing, just by ways of announcements, a few PAG members are standing down. So Voyuswa is going to be standing down. She's felt that she's not been able to contribute at the level that she wants to these discussions, but she is joining the donor reference group. So we're not losing her input entirely. So that's a good outcome. And then Felipe is also going to stand down. He's finding it, that he's not been able to contribute as much as he would like. So we're obviously on the hunt for further members, and we still have a big gap in Latin America. So that's a high priority gap, and we have a gap in Asia, I think, which was one of the points that was made yesterday. Sam, do you want to say anything more about PAG recruitment? Good. Welcome, Pesh. We're nearly everyone here now. So throughout today, we'll be using the presentation as the way to structure all the conversations, because that's helpfully summarized all the key points from the papers that we had and will enable us to deal with the discussions in a very structured way. While you're doing that, we can also congratulate Ian on his re-election as the chair of the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. Congratulations, Ian.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's an extension for another 3 years till the end of 2024, so I know what I'm doing for the next over 4 years.
Good, so let's get started then with the agenda. We're starting at the highest level and we're getting into progressively more detail as we go through the morning, as we go through the consultation paper. So Karen, am I handing to you now?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And I've just turned my video off because my internet is a bit unstable today. So I'm hoping by taking that off, you'll be able to hear me if nothing else. And everyone can hear me at the moment?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. So firstly, I want to say a really big thank you to all of you in providing your comments on the draft that we sent out in July. we had a fabulous response from all the members of the advisory groups, and that has given us a lot of rich feedback to take into account. And we are still in the process of working through all of that feedback. And so unfortunately, we haven't been able to kind of share with you kind of revised drafts today, but we've tried to give some extracts of it to try and help move the conversation forward, and for you to understand kind of how we're dealing with your points that have been raised. So we've structured today into kind of 4 sessions, and as Tim has said, they kind of get progressively shorter as the day goes on, because we wanted to spend most time today on the general issues and on the preface, the introduction, and on part 1, because I think those are the issues that are kind of set the scene for the guidance. We want to make sure that we have got those right. We also have time to look at the specific issues, and then just a bit of time at the end to pick up anything around the supplementary information. So that's how we're looking to structure it today. So I'm going to kick off on sort of general matters and the preface. Phil will lead the session on part 1. I'll do part 2, and then come back to Phil at the end on the supplementary. At least you'll get a change of voice through this. And what we're intending to do for the first 3 of those is to just walk you through what we've seen as some of the key issues that have come up, and we're by no means covering everything. So if you provided feedback on something that we're not talking about today, apologies, but we couldn't cover everything in there. But if it's still important to you and we've not covered it, and you think we've lost something, please do raise it. So we'll do a bit of an introduction, and then there will be a breakout session for you to discuss a number of questions and things that we think are still perhaps the most contentious in there. But obviously that's your opportunity as well. If you feel that we've overlooked something and we've not appreciated the nuances, to raise that there as well.
Sorry, Karen, just Sam, we're still seeing it in the small presenter view. If you can flick the view so it'll be larger on the screen. Thanks, Karen. Carry on while Sam sorts that.
Okay, fine. Okay, so if I take you through the paper 1, the first paper on the general matters and the preface, and I think the first point was that generally the feedback was positive. I think most people felt that this was a step forward from the drafts that they'd seen previously, that it was easier to read, sort of less technical in nature, and felt that it was hanging together as a document. So I think most people couched their feedback in that this was a good step forward, and generally in the right place. But of course, there are some things that we needed to pick up on, and some general issues that came through were, firstly, was about use of terminology. We kind of lacked consistency about use of terminology, and we need to kind of land on some agreed terms that we can use going forward. And I gave some examples. I think they were the predominant ones that came through in the document in the paper. The second point was about the capacity of Mpos to respond to the consultation paper. And I think whilst everyone felt it was a step in the right direction and easier to read, it's still around 250 pages end to end, which makes it a pretty sizable document for people to consume. And there was a concern, if we had a single response date, whether respondents would be able to do the whole lot all in one go. And so the thinking that we've had about that is that we should issue the document in full in one go, but potentially to stagger the response period so that there is a 3-month gap between responding to part 1 and part 2. So that is something that we would welcome views on as we get into discussion later. There was still some concern that whilst it was easier to read, that it was perhaps still slightly technical in places. I think that's probably more in part 2 than perhaps in part 1. But, you know, still be interested in your views on that, and whether that comment resonates with you, whether you still think it's overly technical and would be for the audiences that, you know, that you're part of. Does that sound right? There was another question about translation and whether the document was going to be translated into other languages. I think that we had this conversation very early on in the project and kind of agreed that we would come back to it later. I think later is now upon us. And I think we need to think about, do we want to translate the document? If we do, into which languages should we translate it? And considerations about cost or sponsorship to enable us to do that in a way that's economical for the project. So it would be good to get some thoughts around that. So those were kind of the general issues. In terms of issues related to the preface, there were a number of requests to put more things into the preface, sort of something at the beginning of the document to kind of provide an introduction on top of the preface, to kind of expand section 1, and also to put something in section 4 to explain what a consultation paper is. Our thinking on that is because the document is so long already, we really don't want to expand it if the content is already there in the document. And it may be about how we order things or how we link things, but we really don't want to duplicate. We did see some sense in putting something in the document about explaining what a consultation paper is, because some constituents might not have come across one before, and we saw the real benefit in that. But we would otherwise probably prefer to keep things as they are and use other signposting to try and help people bring together the whole narrative. In section 1, there were a number of comments, some about including comparability and making sure that we were improving trust rather than developing it, because that might suggest there's no trust, so we would need to look at the language there. Paragraph 1.5 about COVID-19 was contentious, in that there were some people who thought that it shouldn't be in the document, and some thought that actually it was really helpful to have something in there to kind of reinforce the need for the project. So again, that may be something on which you have views to share, which would be really interesting. The other point on section that came up in section 1 was about the use of the word accepted regarding the guidance that goes out. I think, as we've discussed previously, we're kind of quite sensitive around this point, because we recognise that it's a matter for each jurisdiction to decide whether they accept this document. And we've heard things that have, if you like, given us pause for consideration around not pushing that too hard as people get familiar with what we're doing with the project. However, we do want to have guidance that is accepted around the world. So we are giving another thought to that to see if there's anything that we can do to kind of strengthen that position. There was some feedback around the objectives, but it was at this point fairly minor in terms of suggested changes. And I think there's kind of no wholesale change to that. The paragraph 3.4, which was about who might benefit from the guidance, which has kind of been a consistent issue about how we express that, again, raised a number of different perspectives, and not all views were the same on that. But we have looked to redraft that paragraph to try and pick up the key elements of some of the feedback that we've had. And again, it's quite an important paragraph, again, so one that we would welcome views on. Similarly, paragraph 3.6 about donors also attracted quite a bit of feedback in terms of how we position this guidance with donors, some feeling that the way we positioned it wasn't strong enough and that we should use stronger language to express our expectations, if you like, of donors going forward. So we have moved that on, but again, it would be good to get feedback around that. And there was also a suggestion in section 5 that we should use an infographic to help people kind of navigate the document and who should be using what parts of the document. And just the final point there I wanted to make, some members wanted to make clear that people are appointed in their individual capacity, not representing the organisations they work for. So we've taken that as read, and we'll make that clearer in the document that's what we're trying to do. So those were the key points, and that's what's reflected in the first paper. And what we would like to do now is to really kind of think about some of those issues and how we're thinking about taking forward those issues and getting your thoughts on this. We've allowed quite a bit of time for this discussion. We've got 30 minutes, I think, set aside for this, because I think these are, really sit at the heart of what we're doing and how we go out into the NPO communities. So we'd really like to try and focus on the opportunities here. And what we are, and I should have said this at the beginning really, what we're trying to do through this is get your input about how we can improve how people understand the document so that they can engage with it. So if you can think about the communities from which you come and put those, put that hat on in thinking about this and just looking at what they might feel about some of the questions that we're raising here. Just was going to pause at that point. Ian, did you want to add anything to what I've just said?
No, other than just to echo your original thanks. I think, it was fantastic, the feedback that's come through. And it is really helpful, I think, actually getting those various different perspectives in, really making sure that this is readable and it's engaging, as well as covering the ground, is really helpful. So, no, thank you very much to everyone for the time that you put into it.
So I think the intention now is that we move into breakout rooms. Sam, can you confirm?
Yeah, so what I would suggest we do, and this is our first attempt at this, right? So is that we have breakout rooms for 15 minutes, and then we have feedback from those for 20 minutes, which will take us through this session. And really, as Karen said, the framing is think from your stakeholders' perspective, because we've put you in kind of stakeholders, and really pick out key feedback now that you want to report back to the full group. The project team, one of us will be in each of those groups, so we will be listening, and that will add, if you like, flavor to what you said. But we do need you to kind of repeat your key feedback in the plenary session when you come back, to kind of really choose that. And of course, that's what gets recorded as well and goes up on the website. The breakout groups are not recorded, so just to understand that. So I've put the questions that you're considering in the chat, because you won't be able to see the PowerPoint once you get in your breakout. So I think you can still refer to the chat, and you do have the PowerPoint. So Sam, if you could send us to our rooms, and as you experienced yesterday, the ending will be abrupt. You'll be pulled back into the plenary meeting at the
maybe
time.
Tim, do you want to speak to the roles of MPO team members or secretariat in those small groups?
Great, yes, thank you very much, Sam. Yeah, so in general, project team, we're there to listen and kind of really absorb, and kind of so that we can, when we do meet together and debrief the meeting, we can kind of add nuance. We're not really there to make our arguments, but if you feel very strongly about something, obviously I wouldn't want you to hold back.
Okay, I'm struggling a bit here to assign the team members, and Pesh, you came later, but I am going to set up the groups and hopefully send you there. Also, Massa hasn't come. So Carolyn and Massa were going to be together, and Monica hasn't come. So in the donor, it's called the donor interest group, but it's got Dorothea, Philip, and Carolyn. So Carolyn, you don't quite fit there, but that's why, because it's got a space in it. So you don't necessarily have to stick to those hats. It's just it was just a mechanism for making other rooms. So feel free to share whichever perspectives fit. So hopefully you'll all go to some meetings. See you soon.
Right.
Shunted into the main room.
Well, welcome back. So that was, as we said, the first time we've tried that. We certainly hadn't got through all the bullet points in our breakout. I don't know about the other groups. So
like I am in a cartoon animated movie like Tom and Jerry, and then Jerry is just pulled back by the dog.
Good. So what I might suggest, if our brains can cope with this, I don't know if they will, is that, yeah, so now we're looking to go back to the more formal style of the normal PAG, but actually if I could encourage you to make your points in the opposite order, so starting at the end of the question list, because we, you know, the project team have probably heard more arguments about the early bullets than they have about the end bullets. So if we could start at the end and go back towards the beginning. So Sam, I don't know if you want to share the screen or if people have still got those. It's quite nice to be able to see people's faces, to be honest. So if we maybe could stick with that.
Well, you could pull up the chat at the side, which has still got the rest.
Chat. Yeah.
It's smaller, isn't it? Yeah. So the first question I'd like you to address is a very important framing question: is the description of the consultation paper and the audience now clear? Did anybody have remaining concerns about that?
I just wanted to make a small point, and it's probably one I've made many times, but I'll make it again. I would say that the primary audience for this is standard setters. In other words, if it doesn't work for them, we're not going to achieve our objective of potentially having new international not-for-profit standards or equivalent or whatever technical thing we want to do. We clearly want to bring loads of other people with us, donors, NPOs, everybody else, not excluding them. But if we don't hit the standard setting community, then we're missing our primary point. That would be my suggestion.
Anybody else have points on that?
Yeah, I think we also discussed that, and you know, the legitimacy of the standards of the regulator. I'll use the word regulator, but whoever they are is really important. And sometimes donors can push reporting, and you know, obviously have when there's been a vacuum or a gap in the standard setting or the regulatory board. So yeah, we need both of those, the donors, but definitely I know, Chris, you said standard setters, but I think we were thinking more about the regulatory board, which probably fits into what you were suggesting.
Great. So we'll take those two comments and we'll move on to the second bullet point up. So thoughts on the proposals for harmonizing terminology. Were people happy with the recommendations? I know, Corinna, you had that one point that we were making. Do you want to just make that point again? I think it's worth making.
Or possibly finish it, because I think you were halfway through it at the time. So.
Right. I was going on the, my point was on harmonizing terminology. As the auditor, some parts of it, to give a clear example, was the special purpose financial statement has a well settled definition that was issued by IFAC some years back. So when we read the consultation paper, the definition that is given there is different or is contradictory to what already is in existence. So I was wondering whether we should perhaps undertake a review to make sure that from various materials that are widely familiar to our stakeholders, we don't get any immediate conflicts with the definitions. Or at least if we do introduce something new, we make a reference that this is different from the IFAG definition of the special purpose financial statement.
Great, thanks, Corinna. Any other points on the harmonizing?
I think it's important to make sure the glossary covers things, and so if there are words that we haven't used because we want to harmonize, that they're in the glossary and they, you know, they sort of point to the word that we have used.
Thanks, Karen. Okay. So moving back further up the list, are there further opportunities to improve clarity? That's quite an open question.
We didn't cover this, but I think it's linked to the audience point because it's clear for who. And that is difficult because it's not everyone's first language. We're often using technical accounting terms, taking the point that Karina just made. Yes, of course, we're all for clarity, but it's in the eye of the beholder. I don't know if that phrase translates. It just means that will look different to all of us, potentially.
Sam?
I'm wondering if I could bring in a point from Mas, actually, who's not here, but he met with me in advance of this meeting to share his opinions. And one of them was about some of the terms that have clear meaning in a for-profit context, like decision useful, efficiency, general purpose financial reports, going concern. Some terms that are used a lot and but have slightly nuanced different meanings in NPO context, and whether we should, for clarity's sake, make it clearer what that word, which feels familiar and people might know, but might mean in an NPO context. So I just wanted to bring that in because that was Massa's point.
Yeah, I saw those points even in the discussion yesterday from Massa. I'm afraid I don't quite agree with all of them because in my experience, many of these terms are used in the not-for-profit context, and I think it's more an issue about language and semantics with how it's being construed. But you know, those terms are universally used, and if we're expecting standard setters to sign up to this, we're not going to find them deviating from the use of language which is universally used in standards. We might need to explain them how they relate to the not-for-profit sector. You know, what does going concern in the not-for-profit sector mean? Why is it different? You know, what are the challenges? But to just sort of say that that you know, all these standards are written for-profit and therefore we need to start afresh. I find that a bit of a struggle.
Just to clarify the point, it wasn't to not use the terms, it was exactly as you said, clarify their meaning in a not-for-profit context.
But if you look at the chat he had yesterday, he was saying that these terms just are not used in the not-for-profit sector and that they're used in the for-profit sector. What I'm saying, I don't agree with that. I see them used a lot in the for-profit and not-for-profit sector.
Yeah, to be fair, in Japan they have, we might think there's a proliferation of SORPs in the UK, but they've got a proliferation of different standards for different types of NPOs, and all the accounting is quite different. So, you know, it's complicated.
Yeah.
So, yes, there's 3 people with their hands up, and I'm afraid I wasn't able to catch which order they went up. So I'm going to call on Ian first, then Tejas, then Karina.
So, I mean, just responding to the point, I mean, I think there are a couple of issues here in terms of I entirely support, you know, if we're going to be setting international standards, then you have to get commonality amongst terms, and that sometimes means that you need to get people to change and to move together on the terminology that's used. I think you do, and I see this in the public sector standard setting, get debates about, well, actually, is it the same or is it something different? And generally, the discussion that we have is, if it's the same, then you use the same term. If it's something different, or if it's a broader context, then you need to make sure that you use a different term. So there's a debate and a discussion to be had about how you do that. But I think in terms of getting a common language, it is really important. If it's the same, then you use the same term. If it's different, and that's part of this process, I think. At a risk of sort of taking the point that Tejas may want to make, I thought she made a very good point about we probably should be putting a question in, which is actually from a sort of, if you like, a local cultural context. Is there anything that we're talking about here that actually won't translate or won't work? Maybe you can express that better, but I thought that was actually something that we hadn't really picked up at this stage, and I thought was a very good point.
So just if you make your point, and if it was the same as well, elucidate Ian's.
Yes and no, kind of. It was a mix of what Chris and Ian just said. I was just looking at the fact that, some of us do, and for me, I feel that a regular NPO accountant should be able to look at these guidelines and, be able to work through them. Whereas there is another reader, which is the standard setter or the regulator. So I don't want, I think it makes sense to do it from the point, since these are international standards, have to be accepted internationally. You do it from the point of view of a standard setter or a regulator, but then you also provide help for a person who has time, energy, and interest and motivation to actually, an NPO accountant actually go through them and understand them. So just like the accounting too, if there are some of the other technical aspects for which we can provide them some more information or some more contextual help, then it might work a little bit better, because as of now, an NGO accountant will not understand what is going on. So, and he or she will have to take the help from the auditors. And then I don't know how different are we from a regular accounting standard, which again needs help from auditors for interpretation. So I think just to look at it from a person who is in an NGO trying to understand what these standards are, there are certain aspects which will need contextual explanations, but cannot be done within this document. It has to be done separately in some other additional resource, is what I feel.
Great, thanks, Tejas. Corinna.
I wanted to support passion in the statement that saying that we shouldn't refrain from using the universal concepts, and saying that, for example, going concern is not for NPOs. For me, this is going beyond common sense. It's the same as to say the going concern for a hotel would be very different from the going concern for the watchmaking plant. Of course, it is different, but we can still use and apply this term. So I think it should be, obviously, there will be terms that we may not use that exist and are universally accepted, but that should be used with moderation. We want the standards to be acceptable internationally.
Great, thanks, Corinna. Innocent, I think you've got your hand up.
All right, thanks, Tim. I think for me, I'm just reflecting on what Sam said, and also Presh, and what is the rest of the team alluded to. From my end, I think we need to strike a balance, to find a balance on those accounting terms. And from a preparer's point of view, I've had nightmares when it comes to issues to do with going concern, deferred income, and those items when it comes to NPO. The auditors, they are more biased towards maybe for profit, and when it comes to the interpretation, they do the interpretation in terms of in that light, which poses challenges for NPOs. So I would say we can adopt the terms as they are, but there is need to really clarify what it means for NPOs. Thank you.
Great. Corinna, is hand still up there or? No. Good. So thank you for airing those points. Pesh, you wanted to make a final point in this area?
Just a brief point that we should be careful not to conflate auditing guidance with accounting guidance. And that's what we found certainly when we were doing the SORP committee and things of that kind. So, the guidance for auditors, what's the difference between auditing a not-for-profit and a for-profit is for a separate thing. Maybe there's an audit practice note on it or something else. This is about financial statements, and that's what we should try to stay with.
Great, thank you. We are at the end of the time, but we have not addressed all the points, so I'm just going to steal a bit more time for this section. So yeah, I think we've made some good points, so we can move on now to the objectives. Are there any remaining concerns about the objectives? Speak now or forever hold your peace, I think is good. Nobody? Excellent. So we'll move on to the translation. There's quite rich discussion in my group about the translation. I think the biggest issue that came up, I'll just share, and fundamentally is, by translating, do you create an expectation that they can provide feedback in that language? And if the cost of the translation wasn't prohibitive, certainly the cost of translating comments that we get back would definitely be prohibitive. So that was one key point that was made in my group.
Tim, there was also, I think, a big point about, most standard setters, and this was something I said I didn't know much about, and Corinna clarified for me about what happens in Russia and places of that kind. Most standard setters issue their standards usually in very limited languages. Certainly the international standards are done on that basis. But also most funders and big international funders, whether they're the EU or USAID or whatever else, or DFID, or even funders in places like India, expect the financial statements to be in English. And so if we start getting to the situation where we are creating the expectation that people will not be able to understand the English in the consultation document, then it begs the question as to how they will be preparing their financial statements in English to meet funders' requirements, to meet standard requirements, to understand the standards, etc., when they're produced.
Chris Harris and Phil Mitchell.
Yeah, we tried to break down the question into two parts, and possibly a third. The first one was, do we need to translate or not? Because we said at the beginning we would just use English, and that was our original decision. So why are we reconsidering? And the second question was, if we are going to if there should be translation, who should do it? Is it us or someone else? And the conclusion, I think we all said, was the core document will be written in English. It absolutely has to be. That's the language we're using and the standard setters are using. But to get a broader acceptance of different parts of the world using French, Spanish, Mandarin, I don't know, key business languages, it clearly has an advantage. It will help the standard and the quality of the feedback that we get in. So that's the reason for doing it, and we all supported that. What we then thought was, we probably didn't think this through very deeply, is that this initiative shouldn't have to do the translation itself. It's expensive, and frankly, we may get the words right, but in terms of the accounting, understanding, and the cultural situations, we're going to struggle. So we felt that was something that's potentially done in a national context around the world, which apparently is sort of what happens in some of the international financial accounting setting anyway. as per Ian fed back to us.
Great. Philip?
Thank you. Similar approach as Chris just described it. So we went for what to translate, and then why should we? So we realized that as well as there being part 1 and part 2 is too huge to translate, so that's sort of off the table. But we were told that there will be a very brief executive summary, and also there's going to have to be a tailored value statement or value proposition to each of these, was it 5 yesterday? Each of these 5 audience groups about why they're receiving it, why they're meant to read it, and what they're meant to do with it. Now, so maybe it's the covering letter, that value statement, and the executive summary that gets translated. We may not need to translate it if it's going to the mega funders, as Pesh was describing. But if I was a Francophone NGO board and you sent me this in English, I wouldn't even open it. In fact, I'd probably be really upset. So if you want any mileage off the Francophone West Africa, and if you want anything maybe off Latin America, I think those first documents really should be in their home language. Over.
Thanks, Philip. Innocent, is your hand still up for this section or not? No. Tejas? Then Jenny.
Yeah, so after the discussion, I actually went to the Institute's website to check if our standards are there in Hindi. So our Institute accountant standards are not in Hindi, and they're in English. So I think for India, the translations can happen obviously when we reach India. So I don't think it makes sense to do it right now. English will work, feedback will come. Because the standard setters, the regulators, the big intermediaries, all of them are English speaking and probably more comfortable actually doing it. So I think, yeah, but I do think that like the summaries or the smaller parts or the more technical parts could be done in, or maybe the reporting or the formats. Some of the aspects, specifically the formats, because in Maharashtra, for example, state that I am, the annual accounts of the charity commissioner have to go in Marathi, which is the regular local language here. So maybe the formats can go in, I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out whether it is possible to make the translation easier than doing the whole thing in a different language, but maybe the key terms or the summaries in the vernacular languages in India. So yeah, so that's, I think, something we should take on later.
Thanks. Jenny?
All I was going to say was that listening to what everybody has said, it sounds like translating during the consultation process for particular parts of the globe. And we were discussing about sub-Saharan Africa and also West Africa and parts of South America. Actually, it is very expensive to do, and maybe this is a funding opportunity for the people that are running this to perhaps approach some funders that have a particular interest in that part of the globe and say, look, we're doing this project. We'd like to have additional funding to be able to consult in those particular areas. And maybe you can raise enough money to be able to do that effectively and properly. That would be all I would offer up. Otherwise, you know, where do you get the funding from?
Great. So let's move then to the first question about the staggering of the consultation into 2 phases, part 1 and part 2.
Yeah, we thought that you know, they both should be put out at once, but the staggered responses, because it gives people time to work through the part 2. But in reading part 1, they can actually dip into part 2 while they're, you know, thinking about a particular issue.
Now, I think it also makes it clearer that for those people who don't want to go into part 2 and all the in-depth, I can just do the first bit and then I can ignore all that techie stuff. So I think that makes it a lot easier for people to distinguish where they can stop and start. We did have a conversation in our group and it was Pesh's idea, and I think he's I don't know if he's on mute or not at the moment, but what Pesh was wondering whether there was a way of somehow providing a sort of checklist at the beginning of, you know, what sorts of things are you interested in? Are you a donor? Are you a grant receiver? And all these sorts of things, so that it could then signpost the sections of the whole consultation that were of interest. So drilling down even more from what I think is a good idea to have stage one and part one and part two, but to drill down even more and just say, well, actually, these bits here will be what really interest you. Now, that might involve some sort of technology solution, and how easy it is to do, we don't know. But we thought that might even make it easier for people to respond to the bits of real interest.
Certainly when we did the SORP, and even on the SORP website now, you can go, it's a sort of a modular approach. So, you know, if you don't have a training subsidiary, you don't need to open those sections at all. If you don't have if you don't do grant making, then you don't need to, if you don't have gifts in kind, then don't bother. So you can just decide which are the areas that are relevant to you and not have to plow all the way through 250 pages. Now, of course, for some of us, maybe auditors and others who have a range of clients, then you'll have to look at the whole of it. But to make it easier for the smaller NPOs, then I think we can do it on that basis.
And I thought there might be an opportunity to combine it with a collection of demographic information about the participating person as well, which we need to do to interpret their responses. Okay, so well done. It's quick bit of feedback before we move to the next one. Anything we should adjust about the small group and then the feedback? Or I think it's still valuable to have both, especially that we've got enough project team members to eavesdrop on the group discussions. So any other reflections, maybe particularly from project team members?
I was just wondering, the way you did the feedback worked quite well to go to the last question first. So I wonder if we split the groups to have some start at the beginning and some start at the end, so that at least some of the groups have discussed all the questions. Maybe split it that way, because you'll inevitably find that we only get part way through.
Right. Any other ideas to improve our cycles? Because we've got 2 more of these cycles.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that it wasn't anything like enough time. So I think what Paul's hinting at, that, you know, split up the task, give us the chance to consider 1 or 2 things reasonably well, rather than not.
Okay, we will attempt that on the next round. Good, we're not having a break yet. The break is not until 05, or we could mix things up. Sam, since we're running behind time, I'm just thinking maybe yeah, because didn't we in the agenda we had
the break now?
Yeah, because in the agenda we had the break before the feedback from this next section. So maybe it would be better to take the feedback now and then run that whole next section as a contiguous chunk. Does that make sense? And maybe because we're doing social interaction in the groups, could we have a shorter break, so it's genuinely a comfort break? So we come back at 10 minutes to the hour in 7 minutes time. Is that okay? I hope that's all right with everybody. Making you work hard today because there's a lot to get through. So see you in 7 minutes. Great, so I'll just frame this briefly. And I think I just wanted to have one kind of reflection on that earlier discussion, which I think is important to bear in mind for the remainder of the meeting. I think we've reached increasing clarity about the audience, and that idea that the primary audience is standard setters and regulators, especially when it comes into the more detailed sections, is something for us to bear in mind, and that the increasing use of other collateral material, the website explainer stuff, is going to be what's needed to bridge some of our audience. But if we fail to win over and use the language that is expected of that first group, then the whole project will fail. I think there's a piece of clarity that we should bear in mind. So over to you, Philip.
Sorry, can I just ask a question? If the primary audience is standard setters, is there then an assumption that those countries that have their own current not-for-profit standard will pick up this one rather than their own, like New Zealand and the UK? So would you see this replacing the UK charity SORP?
In an ideal world, yes, Jenny. It may take some years. And when
otherwise,
yes.
So who's going to use it then? If our primary, I'm just trying to understand. Okay, 'cause it's important when I'm talking to people. So I'm not.
Yeah. So when we have the UK country champion, which is the Charities Finance Group, we'll be inviting domestic UK charities to be participating in this consultation.
Unless the UK Charities Commission adopts it and removes the UK Charities SORP, what organisation in the UK is going to do it? Because they already have to.
Exactly, but that's the ultimate direction of travel is for everybody to be harmonising, which so all jurisdictions.
Thank you.
And the application will be completely different in different countries. If there's nothing, then hopefully this is a starting point. In others, it will be alongside whatever they've already got. And hopefully we'll begin to provide some unifying purpose, which at the moment we don't have, as we know. So the effect of this will vary.
So,
that's what I mean.
I have discussed this with the chairs of the SORP committee, and also I know that Jenny responded to our points which we raised in the blog, and the thinking there is that the SORP, SORPs are basically designed to interpret the financial reporting standards for a special sector. So here, if you have a special sector financial reporting standard, there is perhaps no need to interpret it in the same way. But at the moment, the SORP goes further than the financial reporting standards. So it may cover areas, for example, particularly it'll cover all the narrative reporting. It covers things like, wanting to have a disclosure of remuneration bans and things of that kind. So you might still have a SORP in place, but it would then be adhering to this standard if it becomes an international standard rather than FRS 102 or something of that kind. And that's the thinking.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna put Jenny. Thanks for raising that point. If we can continue it maybe offline, because I know how much we've got to get through today. So sorry about that. So over to you, Philip.
Thank you. Just before I begin, just to reiterate what Karen said, and the thanks for all of the clearly exceptionally hard work that's gone into providing us with comments. What we're looking at here are the most significant issues raised by TAG and PAG members to part one. In total, for part one, we had several hundred specific general comments and edits. So if you can't see specifically comments you've raised reflected in here, don't worry. All the comments have been reviewed and discussed and taken into consideration, but we wanted to focus on these key ones where maybe there was more than one member raised the issue, and the ones we think are most significant for taking forward the part one redraft. On chapter one, which was intended to provide readers with an overview of the broad characteristics approach, there are three main issues that we wanted to highlight. The description of MPOs and the figure used, the use of existing international frameworks to provide a description of MPOs, and the placement of the discussion on MPOs who will benefit from the guidance. In terms of proposed way forward, I think we've accepted that we need to make greater use of existing international frameworks. So we are going to be directly using the SNA description and supplement it with the focus on key economic events, and we're going to be altering the figure to try and show that SNA 4 sector breakdown. So hopefully you'll be able to see that in the next draft. I think it's not quite finished yet, but it does come across a lot clearer, and it's going to link through to the supplementary information as well. So it should be an easier description of MPOs for readers to understand and use. In terms of the MPOs that will benefit from the guidance, I think we originally had in chapter 1 the description of the MPOs, and we've moved that to chapter 5. I think we are going to retain the text in chapter 5, but the executive summary will sort of tee up readers as to the types of MPOs we'll be focused on initially, and we're going to include a new paragraph in chapter 1 to better link this discussion with the discussion on accountability and decision-making needs of stakeholders that is covered in chapter 2. For chapter 2, which covered who MPO stakeholders are and their needs, two main issues raised. One, the extent to which we are reflecting stakeholder needs, their accountability and decision-making needs, and the difference between a sort of general stakeholder need and the need of stakeholders as users specifically of financial information. So on that, we've actually put in some proposed new text, which you can see below, which we're hoping improves the distinction between the information needs of stakeholders, the information needs specifically of users of financial reports, and how accountability and decision-making needs might differ. So that proposed revised wording is included below. And if we can jump, Sam, to the next slide, and the slide after that, please. And then, yeah, there for issue 6. There were also some comments about some of the assertions in the chapter and the extent to which we were potentially overstating the use that donors make decisions on the basis of the financial reports that are going to be covered by the guidance. So we are looking to amend the wording in this area to recognise donors are going to continue to require MPOs to report directly to them, but that this project can support potentially a reduction in reporting burden by enabling greater use of MPO financial reports. On to chapter 3, which looks at the essential aspects of MPO financial reporting guidance. 3 main issues raised. One, there was an insufficient explanation on the 2 core propositions that we'd included. So we've proposed to increase the discussion on these and better link them to the information that was in chapter 2. And again, we've included text here. And Sam, if you could change the slide to the next page, please. And in this slide, which we think better explains the 2 core propositions and why we think they're important. There were comments about a lack of recognition that actually MPOs and donors do make some use of modified cash accounting and reporting, and that there will always be challenges regardless of this project about reporting on non-financial information, things like budget versus actual. So we have looked to amend text as well to provide greater recognition that modified cash basis is used by some MPOs and donors, and that there will be information still needed outside of the financial reporting that will be covered by this project. And so I'm sorry, if we can move to the next slide, which would be issue 8 here. Issue 9 was the extent to which we were accurately reflecting special purpose financial reporting, or whether we were discussing special purpose financial statements. The section of this chapter where we were referring to special purpose financial reports was intended to cover both special purpose financial statements and the broader type of special purpose financial reporting noted in the feedback. So we are amending the text to cover that. On to chapter 4, which looks at how far international financial reporting regimes can assist MPOs. 3 main comments. One, the argument as to why an international framework needs to be used rather than a national framework or a standard already tailored to MPOs was not sufficiently clear. So we're looking to amend the relevant paragraphs to better explain the argument as to why we need to begin from an international framework. 2, the figure which tries to show the extent to which guidance is already provided by international frameworks. A lot of people found it confusing and overly detailed for the audience that this part of the document is aimed at. So we are looking to significantly simplify this figure. And then there will still be the detail in the supplementary information if people want to get really into the individual standards. And then finally, a comment raised by a number of people was the extent actually to which preparers, users and auditors are familiar with IFRS for Smes, and the extent to which we might be overstating the familiarity, and the extent to which actually it is a stable framework given that it is currently undergoing a comprehensive review. So we will be looking to change the text in this area to potentially better reflect the uncertainty over familiarity with IFRS for Smes, and to reflect the fact that the argument for stability is not so much that it's currently under a comprehensive review and that it's never reviewed, it's that it's updated less frequently than the other framework. So generally in the long term, it will be a more stable framework. And then finally, Chapter 5, the proposed way forward. Perhaps the biggest overarching general comment received by 2 or 3 members is the use of IFRS for Smes, given that it is a for-profit framework. So I think this was raised by a number of people, and Massa raised this as well. And the figure used to show the NPOs that the guidance will initially be aimed at. There is still a view amongst some members that the use of service delivery and sources of funding as the axes doesn't actually reflect how MPOs will see themselves, and doesn't actually affect how they think individual MPOs might look at themselves. So whether we need to make substantive changes to this figure or not, at the moment, our view is that some proposed changes don't actually improve the argument that's made, but as this is the PAG, and as this group can probably best reflect the views of the sector, comments on that would still be appreciated. So a very whistle-stop tour through the sort of main issues received. In terms of the discussion now, I think if we move to slide 18, Sam. I think the points for discussion for this breakout session that we're really focused on were the proposed position of who will benefit from the guidance, the description of stakeholder needs and the changes we have proposed to make, our introduction to section 3 and the 2 core propositions, and then those ongoing concerns about the presentation of IFRS for Smes and its use. And if we do have time, the general matters for comment and whether we can improve those in order to get the best possible feedback from the paper.
Great. So Sam, are you ready to do breakouts in a second? So what I might suggest is that the auditors start at the bottom and work their way up. And the donors start in the middle, with that question around accrual-based reporting and narrative reporting, and then go in the direction that they feel most drawn to, either up or down. Okay, and then the MPOs work from the top down to the bottom, if that's okay.
Okay, so for the rooms, you're in the same groups, but you've got different, I hope you've got different team members with you. If you haven't, please reach out to me and I'll correct that, but that's my intention. So how long, Tim? Is it another 15 minutes?
It will be exactly 15 minutes, please.
And I hope you've all each got this, because I can put these questions in the chat, but you won't find them in your new rooms. So hopefully,
I've already put them in the chat, Sam. They're good to go.
Yeah, but when you go to the new rooms, it won't be there anymore. So copy from this chat if you need to, or open the slide deck yourselves, ideally. All right, see you in 15 minutes.